Welcome to the next episode of PLO Order's weekly videos. Today's file name is Donk or check raise. So when to donk and when to check raise in heads up out of position. And what we're going to do today is focus on some general guidelines how to pick up whether should we use a donk strategy or check raise strategy more. And then on one certain board, let's see some solver frequencies and how that affects the ranges. All right. So let's start. The question is to donk or not to donk. And in general, as in anything, it's harder to master two things than one thing. And what I mean by that is it's easy to make one range solid. And as an example, check raise. So if your overall strategy on flop is to check your whole range and then check raise with somewhat balanced range, like we have value hands in our check raising range and we have semi-bluff on our check raising range, and on certain boards we have value hands and we have total bluffs. So it's very polarized. Like on locked boards, paired boards, we could check raise trips or better for value and total air as a bluff and blockers. And on more dynamic boards, we check raise sets, nuts, super strong draws for value, and then we check raise medium strength draws, or not medium, but like pair nut flush draw as a semi bluff. And it's easy to construct that range. The problem is when you add donking range, it's harder to make both of them balance, because let's say you add top set on your donking range. And if you always donk your top set, then you don't have top set in your check raising range. Okay, you take half of your top sets into your donking range. Which half? So you need to have a plan what sets are in donking range, what are in check raising range, so that it doesn't get too unbalanced and biased to one or other. And that's the hard part that we have when we try to build up both ranges. One thing to figure out and think about is the general population c-bets way too much compared to solver strategy. If we use solver strategy as one starting point, they c-bet too much and their c-betting ranges are bad. And easy solution how to adjust to that is not to donk. That's the easy way. And that's why I often tell beginning players that don't donk in your standard strategy, because it's harder to have good donking range and check raising range. Go only for check raising. People still c-bet too much. You very often get to check raise with your strong hands. And when we start to donk, then the problem is that when you donk, an opponent calls you, the calling range is still uncapped. So let's say you donk, opponent calls, he still has the nuts. If you check raise and he calls, often if he has the nuts, he would just re-raise you. Or if you c-bet an opponent calls, the chance of having nuts goes down a lot. But when you donk, people often call with nuts because they are in position. They don't need to blow the pot. But if you bet if you bet from position and the out of position, they just check calls, then there's a high chance he doesn't have nuts. And that's why donking makes turns and rivers really hard. And if you're not bluffing and you're donking with value hand, then the donk forces the opponent to play well against your actual hand. And that's why being balanced is very important. And what I have seen on small stakes about people's donking range, it doesn't have any balance. Some people donk strong hands, some people donk total air on bad boards, some people donk with blockers, but they don't barrel the turns and rivers, and there's no balance. Check raising range might have better balance, but donking ranges are not. And the thing is that as no one really donks, it also opens a door to really exploit people by donking. If you master your donking ranges and see how opponents react. Because I'm quite sure that people either overfold to donks or play badly versus them. But once you create balance for your donking range, your check raising range might get unbalanced, and that's a problem. And that's the hard part. And for some reason, my hologram video is really screwed. Not sure what has happened. Let's see if I can fix it, because we don't want to have but I can fix it. There it is. Why do we... Alright, now it's better. Weird. So, let's move on. The easy way around is to use donk only in special situations for value. And our standard strategy is to check everything. Now, the important thing is to understand that in poker we should have a standard strategy, which means the strategy we use versus unknowns in certain situations, and often starting point is 100 pp deep. So it's the strategy we follow when we don't have any information about the opponent. And we should always have the strategy. It could be mixed. I don't believe in a lot of mixed strategies in small stakes. Like sometimes I do this hand, I raise, sometimes I call, and so on. I would stick to certain hands and then base the different actions based on blockers and backdoors and everything like that. But we should have a basic strategy that we follow. And once we get information on the opponent, then we can adjust and deviate from the basic strategy. But if we don't have basic strategy, we're just clicking buttons, and if we don't make money, we don't have any sort of starting point that we start to work. We don't have any way to see that, okay, I've played 100,000 hands, traffic's going down, my basic strategy doesn't work. So I can start to find nicks in my basic strategy. But if I play 100,000 hands where my strategy constantly changes, there's no base point to focus on and reflect on. And for small stakes, if you're a beginner and trying to create balanced donking and raising range seems hard, the easy solution is that we don't donk in our standard strategy. And I've used that a lot because people still see bet too much. So you can make a lot of money in small stakes without having donks in your standard strategy. But we use them in special situations for value. And one is to get value from check happy opponent. So we go for check raise until we see that, okay, opponent doesn't see bet. He has more balanced c-betting strategy. We see that he starts to check back his medium strength hands. He doesn't bluff flops often enough. So we adjust and we start to donk some of the hands we would check raise. Or another situation, opponent is very raise happy, and if we donk, he always raises us. He doesn't give any credit for our donks or bets. So then we can induce a raise with our strong hands. And those are the two special occasions. Versus unknowns, you go for 100% check. And then your check raising range is more balanced, so opponent cannot attack your checks that happily. But then a few words about GTO droids. Solver droids. And now this is where things get a bit confusing. Game theory wise, if opponent doesn't donk, we should see bet less than overall solver strategy. So if you just check out solver strategy on certain boards, that okay, solver c bets here 60% of times with these hands, then it assumes opponent also donks the solver strategy amount. And now if opponent doesn't donk, which is very true in small stakes, like on PLO 10, PLO 20, people don't donk, then your c-bet frequency should go down, because solver assumes that opponent donks certain range, which means that his checking range is weaker. But if he doesn't donk, he has all his nuts and strong hands, value hands in his checking range. So you should c-bet less. If we c-bet as often as we would versus donkers when they don't donk, then the opponent gets more value for his check raises, and his checking becomes more profitable than it would if we adjust too. But then the thing is that when we check, an opponent c-bets like as often, he might even have solver and he sees that on this board we c-bet 60%, and he c-bets 60% versus the range that we check. Now it means that we exploit him by checking more than donking. So if you can grab the idea, the thing is that as opponents don't change their c-betting strategy based on whether you donk bet or not with balance range, which is 100% true or 99.9% true on small stakes, you actually exploit them by checking more. And that's why starting with 100% check range out of position heads up is actually a pretty working strategy in the long run. So whether you donk or not, and this video is about heads up. When we hit multi-way, that's when I start to donk a lot. Because in multi-way, people don't c-bet as often. Everyone plays according to their hand strength. So if you have a strong hand, donk a lot, start to build up the pot if you want to play a big pot on the river. All right, let's check out some examples. First one, or the only situation, first and last situation, big blind versus button, which means that big blind opened, small blind folds, button calls. And the flop is Jack 9-4. Now, solver strategy. For the big blind, after it called, he is first to act post flop. Flop is Jack 9-4. Solver strategy on PLO 50 rate. Run it once, 50% rate back if you like the details. Donk 18% of hands and check 82. On Jack 9-4, single suited. So 18% is a lot. If you want, let's say you want to check raise 18% of hands on this flop, it means there's a lot of value hands and a lot of combo draws. 18% is a lot of hands. But when the big blind checks, so it's one of those 82% of hands, and then button C bets, then big blind is going to raise 12% of hands. So he's check raising 12%, check calling 38, and check folding half of his hands. So try to remember the numbers. Donking 18%, and with the donking, check raising 12%. So donking or check raising 30% total. If we have a no donk strategy, which means that the big blind's first action is 100% check, this was the easy road. Then versus the button C bet. Remember, the numbers were 12% raise, 38% call. It doesn't really change much. The only change is that it calls 2% more. So actually, your checking strategy on Jack 9-4 doesn't really change whether you have a donking strategy or not, and that's quite fascinating. But yeah, that's how it goes. So if you have built up some kind of check raising range, then the frequencies stay the same. We're not going to the actual hands. That would make this video very long. So we're scratching the surface. All right, versus C-bet. If you have the option to donk, but you don't, you check. And then the button bets, then the numbers were 12, 38, and 50. And if you don't have a donk in range, it was 12, 40, 48. So these are the same numbers, but now you can see them side to side. So there really isn't a change in your strategy versus those C bets. But how often button C bets? That's the thing. When the small blind has an opportunity to donk, but he doesn't, he checks, then button is going to continuation bet on Jack 9-4 suited 46% of times. But if the small blind doesn't have a donking strategy, then he's only going to c-bet 37%. So button c-bet range is a lot stronger when the opponent doesn't donk. And then versus that stronger range, actually, then the frequencies are quite the same. But the bottom line of the video is to show that it's very complicated to get a good donking and check raising ranges, because then you really need a solver, and then you need to do a lot of work to figure out like what kind of sets solver wants to donk on the flop, what kind of sets he wants to check raise on the flop. And then you have to do that on different strengths of hands, sets, middle sets, bottom sets, 2 pairs with the draw, 2 pairs without the draw, and then on different board types and board structures, and it's going to be a long way. You can't have any easy guidelines for that. If you do the work, you're going to be a better player. And then when opponent starts to be decent in c-betting, PLO 50, PLO 100, PLO 200, good reps, then you have more tools to fight back them. But if you play on small stakes, PLO 50 all over, you can get really far with 100% check as a standard strategy. And then figure out that we check raise value hands, we check raise combo draws or bluffs, semi-bluffs, and then sometimes we check call with strong hands too, if the opponent is really good at one blunt, versus 90% of your opponents, you can just check raise for value hands, check raise semi-bluffs, and you don't need to protect your check calling range, because opponents will not exploit you. So if you play small stakes, I wouldn't worry too much about donking. You don't need donking strategy to make money on PLO 50 all over, period. If you start to add donking without having access to solver and understanding how solver works, then probably starting to donk as a standard strategy is going to mess up your game very easily. You can do it versus good opponents, like you have a rep who is playing decent poker. Or let's say I'm playing nut raising and I know he's a good player, and I just need to mess up a little, make him guess a little, put him on out of his comfort zone. Then you might add some donks here and there, just to show him that, okay, I can donk. You have to think that I might have a donking range. And it doesn't have to be balanced. You're just playing meta game. You put your opponent on his heels. He has to guess a little. He has to somehow adjust and react that, okay, he's donking on certain flops. And especially if the hand's never go to showdown, he doesn't know what you donk with. So he's guessing. He doesn't know that, what was it? But he sort of have to react somehow that every now and then you're donking. And you don't have to be balanced. What it does, that his focus is out of something more important, or he reacts in the wrong way. But you don't need super balanced donking range, because you actually exploit your opponents by checking more than solver does. And if the opponent is playing really balanced poker, and you need to play balanced poker, then probably you should get a solver or a vision or masterminds bucket tool or whatever you get your hands on and just learn, and it's going to be a long journey. You don't learn docking range in one video. Even on this one board we can spend 1 or 2 hours exploring the docking range and then the check raising range and how they correlate with each other on different opponent types and so on. But I hope this clarifies a little about donking. For later videos we actually could do on this same flop what is solver's donking range and check raising range. So if you want to see part 2 with the actual hands and frequencies, so we get our hands dirty on the solver, then just let me know on the Discord and I will add it to the voting. Alright, hope you enjoyed another episode of PLO Order's weekly videos. I will see you later. Bye bye.